Okay, this is just basically going to go through a few more current things for your exam. First of all, when you talk about supply side questions, and I've said this a lot, but it's all about trying to increase our willingness and ability to supply. You really need to articulate that it's about in trying to increase the quantity and quality of our resources through either increasing productivity and participation, which allows an economy, and this is the key word, which allows an economy to sustain any increases in aggregate demand without inflationary pressures. So it allows an economy to produce more because we have a greater access to resources, which allows us to meet any extra demand without inflationary pressures. So when you're talking about the term productive capacity, what that means is an improved ability of the nation to produce goods and services. Okay, it's like when the PPF shifts outwards. If you want to define productive capacity by saying that it's a shift outwards in the PPF, which comes about through an increase in access to resources or quality of resources, then that is fine. The other things that can increase our productive capacity are things like the youth jobs path. And if you're linking that to productive capacity, what we mean is that because we have a more skilled workforce, this helps to expand our productive capacity because our existing workers are able to produce more because they're better at what they do. So in last year's exam, it said discuss how an increase in aggregate supply might contribute to an increase in the rate of economic growth. So what you need to do is define what an increase in aggregate supply means. It means that firms are more willing and able to produce at any given price. This can come about through increased participation or productivity. It means that we have a greater quantity and quality of resources available to meet any extra demand. This should help keep production costs low, increase firms' willingness to supply, and therefore allow for non-inflationary growth. It also boosts our international competitiveness and the demand for exports. Factors impacting house prices, again, would be a hard question, particularly the supply side. But from a demand point of view, things to talk about is increased foreign investment, particularly from China, lower interest rates, immigration, and perhaps the fact that more people are relocating to Victoria and New South Wales after the mining boom, all increasing demand for housing. In terms of supply is a little bit harder, but what some of the things you could talk about, and this I've just got this straight off the website, but the slow rate at which the state governments are releasing government-owned land and rezoning urban fringe and industrial land for residential development, which basically means, and I'll just summarise that, is that the government is releasing less land available to produce houses and therefore making it harder to supply. If you're really struggling, just basically say that there's less land available because of the government, and therefore that is leading to higher, more shortages in the supply of housing. There's a question about rezoning urban fringe and therefore allowing more land in your insight exam. That's basically the opposite of that. Another one is the capacity constraints in the building industry. There's been a lot of resources devoted to things like large-scale government projects, like investing in schools. So there's less resources available for building, and therefore that's reducing the increase in supply of housing. So that's another good one to talk about, is that resources are being used up in other areas, and therefore that's reducing the amount of resources available for construction. The impact of rising house prices on living standards, again, you can take it from a good perspective or a bad perspective. From a good perspective, it's increasing the wealth of existing homeowners. You can talk about the asset price channel, how they're more likely to spend because they know they've got a higher wealth or higher levels of wealth. It's increased building construction, so it's boosting the demand for labour because we're producing more houses to meet that extra demand. From a negative point of view, you could talk about the reduced housing affordability and people are getting priced out of the market. It's also a negative of low interest rates at the moment. Increased debt levels because people are going to have to go into more debt to purchase houses. And the fact that people have to travel longer to get to work, if you want to make the link to non-material living standards, a lot of people can't afford to buy houses in inner city areas, so they have to travel longer to get to work because that's the only way they can afford a house. So that's another impact on non-material living standards. Direct action plan. Direct action plan, learning this is not a choice thing. It's the only current government policy that we've actually looked at this year. So it's if you do get asked for a current policy, and it is the last year of the study design, so it is possible, you need to be able to talk about the direct action plan. So go back, have a look at your notes if you haven't looked at it, make sure that you can articulate in 2 marks exactly what this direct action plan means, and say things like it's a $2.55 billion emission reduction fund. It's designed to support businesses and households to take practical action against climate change, and basically what it's doing is that every 3 months they are going to hold reverse auctions, where businesses submit proposals for what they're going to do to try and reduce their level of emissions. This includes things like upgrading the buildings, investing in energy-efficient facilities, capturing gas produced by landfill waste to reduce their emissions, all this kind of stuff, upgrading vehicles, planting trees, all this kind of stuff, reducing the amount of transport costs. The idea of this is by holding these reverse auctions, people buy these permits and therefore they use them, and therefore they're more likely to invest in renewable energy because they're getting a subsidy for doing so. So the Clean Energy Regulator holds auctions every quarter to purchase these emission reductions at the lowest possible cost. So make sure that you are aware of the direct action policy. Alright, when you're talking about immigration and trade liberalisation, people are pretty good at these, but I just wanted to show in these notes just a collection of buzzwords to use. So we're talking about immigration, you want to be talking about increased quantity of labour resources, so a bigger participation rate, helps to reduce wage pressures. And the other thing is it increases the quality of labour resources because they're coming over here with new skills and new production techniques. So if you're talking about immigration, every single time you want to mention lower wage pressures, increased quantity of resources, and increased quality of resources because they have skills. This allows us to boost our productive capacity and allows for higher non-inflationary growth. They're the buzzwords they're looking for when talking about immigration, how that boosts supply. Increased quantity, more people here, lower wages. Increased quality because they've got skills, increased productivity. In terms of trade liberalisation, key words that there's increased competition. Because there's increased competition, it forces us to lower our production cost or try and become more efficient, to become competitive. This helps to boost productivity, define productivity. And then this helps to improve our international competitiveness because our prices are lower, and this will help to make firms more willing and able to supply, and therefore allow for more strong and sustainable growth. I'd also chuck in there this idea of trying to shift resources to areas of comparative advantage, because that's also going to lead to increased efficiency. Alright, something else that's really relevant in terms of the economy at the moment is the level of underutilisation in the economy. So one reason why the RBA is lowering the cash rate at the moment, and there are other reasons, but one really main reason is because of the increased level of underutilisation. So while the unemployment rate's fallen, the labour force is still relatively weak because there's lots more people that are being forced to become part-time and casual. So therefore, there's more people that aren't earning a factor income, or they are earning a factor income, but it's not as high as what they would if they were full-time, so that's leading to less consumption spending. The fact that the businesses have got more workers to choose from, and there's not sort of a pressure on labour resources or capacity constraints, is reducing supply inflation or cost-push inflation as well. So the increased prevalence of underutilisation is leading to significantly less inflation, and is one reason why the RBA is able to take a more expansionary stance. So it's important to know why the underutilisation rate has increased, and that's because of casualisation and the impact that that can have on factor incomes and spare capacity and the RBA's monetary policy stance. Factors impacting equity, I'm not going to talk about these now, we've talked about them a lot, but growth in underemployment is one good reason why it's hurting equity. More people being forced into casual work, and therefore that's leading to them having lower factor incomes, and therefore finding it hard to achieve a dignified standard of living as well. Lower growth in real wages is another one, because a lot of these low-income earners aren't experiencing increases in wages that are strong enough. There's also been a lot of jobs cut in the public sector, over 16,000 in the last 4 years. In terms of helping equity, you've got things like removing the carbon tax, the superannuation tax concessions, and so on and so forth. Alright, one other thing that we haven't really touched on in class, but it's one thing you can talk about as a supply-side policy, is the continual rollout of the national broadband network. And this is really important because it is a key supply-side policy at the moment. I doubt you would get a specific question on the national broadband network, but it is something good to talk about when you're linking things to aggregate supply. So what it basically is it's designed to increase the nation's productive capacity by increasing the speed of telecommunications. So basically people are getting access to more affordable, cheaper internet, and therefore it's allowing them, because they've got faster broadband speeds, it's allowing them to cut production costs and communicate more with clients and staff and suppliers, which is helping to increase their productivity. I mean, we all use the internet. I'm sure you're all aware that if internet speeds are quicker, you're more productive with your homework. You really just need to link that to businesses. Businesses are able to, communicate more effectively with clients and staff. They should be more productive. They can teleconference and things like that, which leads to lower production costs because you have to go visit clients. It should help to promote material living standards because faster broadband speeds should increase our international competitiveness and create jobs. Helps to keep prices down because we're doing things quicker or more productively. Help non-material living standards because less time is spent telecommunicating, and therefore we've got more time for leisure and things like that. So make sure you know the basics about the national broadband network and how it can help. If you are getting questions about factors impacting the cash rate, and I mentioned this in the 2015 review, make sure you're talking about things that are going to impact inflation. So what's the thing you're going to talk about? How is it impacting inflation? So it could be increased underutilisation, and then link it to how that can affect the RBA's monetary policy stance. You can link that to the fact that inflation's at 1%, and therefore the RBA is looking to be highly expansionary at the moment. The exchange rate channel, when you're talking about the exchange rate channel, just a couple of key things to be aware of is that it's about, it will change the level of capital inflow into the economy. And what I mean by that is basically overseas investors try and not use the term they invest in our banks. It just sounds a bit basic. What's better is to say that there's less investment in what we call these interest-bearing deposits in Australia, which is basically just any form of deposit that will generate interest because they're going to generate a lower return. So when the cash rate falls, there'll be more supply of the Australian dollar because we will invest more in foreign interest-bearing deposits, and there'll be less demand because less foreigners will be investing in Australian interest-bearing deposits. And the last thing on this video is talking about the Gini coefficient for different types of income. It's really important that you know all of these. Key things is that this one has the lowest Gini coefficient, social wage income, that all these things that affect final income do not affect social wage income because final income comes last, but all of these things here will actually impact social wage income. So this one is the most equitable, social wage income. Final income is the best measure of our actual living standards. Market income is the least equitable. And then you also want to be aware of some policies that we can use to try and achieve each of these, being really specific. It's also good with equity questions if you can link back to the different types of income. So what I mean by that is if you're talking about from this year's budget the super changes, you can talk about how that affects disposable income. If you're talking about the changes in excise taxes, you can link that to final income. Or if you're talking about the youth jobs path, you probably link that to market income. Try and mention the Gini coefficient as much as possible in policy mix questions. Finally, just a couple of other tips. If you're mentioning international competitiveness, it basically means we're able to compete with other countries in terms of the price and quality of goods and services. If you ask a question about how things are going to impact aggregate demand, make sure you're linking it to the components of aggregate demand. So the C, the I, the X component. Don't be talking about sort of micro concepts like how it's going to affect individual businesses. Talk about the economy as a whole and macro aggregate demand factors. Same with supply side questions. You want to be linking it to our productive capacity and our overall ability to supply. Other things people are doing probably a bit too much. When you're talking about immigration, don't talk about immigrants stealing our jobs too much because they're not meant to be immigrating here if it's done correctly, if they're going to be stealing Australian jobs. You want to be talking about how the increased participation rate can lead to more jobs as a whole, particularly for unskilled workers, and that can be the migrants themselves. When you're talking about monopolies, don't say they can charge whatever price they want. That's not true because they still want people to buy their products. You're better off saying they're able to restrict supply. Okay, they are still subject to the law of demand. They will still receive less profits when they sell at a high price if it's too high. If people aren't going to buy the product. Deterioration in the budget. What's causing this is really important. So you've got to be aware of some things that are causing the budget to stay low, like low commodity prices. So when I say low, high deficit. And also some things that are going to help reduce the size of the budget deficit, like things like the unemployment rate falling slightly at the moment, or some contractionary policies in the budget. Negative externalities, you won't get full marks unless you explain what the negative externality is. If you're talking about something like an excise tax, make it clear that the negative externality with smoking is passive smoking, the health effects, it can cause lung cancer for others, it can cause emphysema, it can cause more government funds to be devoted towards externalities. It's also really good if you can think of other ways besides just excise taxes that the government intervene. So you can talk about like laws against smoking in public places is really good as well. Other tips, industry sectors. If you do get a question about that again, it basically means like different sectors of the economy like mining and manufacturing. At the moment, the healthcare industry is one of the ones that are really booming at the moment. If you're talking about financing a deficit, don't talk about using equity. Talk about how they can either finance it by borrowing from overseas or buying from Australian companies or banks, and that can lead to increased national debt regardless of who they borrow from. When you get a question that asks you about macroeconomic demand policies, it means budgetary and monetary policy. And finally, it's good to know the stance over the last 3 or 4 years, not just this year. So in 2013, monetary policy was at 3.5% for cash rate. By 2014, it was down to 2.5%. And then over the last 2 years, it's been cut twice in both years. In terms of budgetary policies, they've been pushing for fiscal consolidation, and the budget's been slightly reducing over recent years. Thank you.